He lived in a quiet neighborhood where the streets were lined with trees, and most of the neighbors greeted each other with a simple nod or a smile. His house was modest but tidy. A small garden grew in the front yard where flowers bloomed in careful rows. From the outside, he seemed like any ordinary man, someone who liked order, routine, and peace. People might have thought he spent his days quietly, perhaps working in an office or doing some normal job. But the truth was he carried a past few could even imagine. Every morning he woke up early, long before the sun rose. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen as he made his cup just the way he liked it, strong and bitter. He spent a few minutes on the porch listening to the morning birds and watching the neighborhood slowly come alive. Children walked to school, cars drove by, and a few neighbors took their dogs for a morning walk. He often smiled at them, returning a friendly wave, though he kept most of his life private. He liked it that way. Privacy meant safety, and safety had always been important to him. Despite his calm life, tension had been brewing in the area for months. A gang had moved into the neighborhood, known for causing trouble and spreading hate. They did not care about people's feelings or property. They liked to make others afraid, and they especially targeted anyone who looked different or didn't fit their idea of who belonged. For weeks, the neighborhood had been noticing small things. Trash cans knocked over, graffiti on walls, tires slashed. Nothing major at first, but enough to make people uneasy. Most tried to ignore it, hoping it would pass, but the gang's attacks were only growing bolder. He had seen them around. A group of young men, loud and aggressive, wandering the streets at odd hours. They often shouted insults, sometimes at random people, sometimes just at anyone who happened to be outside. It didn't bother him much at first. He knew how to avoid trouble, how to stay unnoticed, how to walk past danger without it finding him. But the gang's energy was different. They were careless, reckless, and cruel. And soon he would discover they had set their sights on him. The first real incident happened one evening as he returned home from the store. He had stopped to pick up a few things: bread, eggs, some milk. The air was warm, with a light breeze that carried the faint smell of flowers from his garden. As he approached the driveway, he noticed something strange. A few trash cans had been tipped over, their contents spilling across the concrete. He frowned, picked up the cans, and put them back. He assumed it was a prank, something kids often did. But then he noticed the paint on the garage door. It was spray-painted, messy and cruel. Words he would never want to read about himself were scrawled across the metal in bright red letters. He felt a tight knot in his stomach, a combination of anger and disbelief. Who would do this? Why him? He stepped closer, careful not to touch the paint. There was something unsettling about the way it had been done. It was not random, it was meant to be noticed. He did not react immediately. Instead, he went inside, locked the doors, and sat in his living room with his cup of coffee. His hands were steady, but inside he was calculating. He thought about what he had learned during his life, about vigilance and patience. He knew that losing control would only give them the reaction they wanted. He stayed calm even though the anger was simmering. Neighbors came by the next day, some whispering and asking if he was okay. Others pretended nothing had happened, walking past his house as if it were just another normal day. He smiled politely, thanked those who asked, and ignored the rest. He didn't want anyone to see more than what was necessary. He had always been careful about that. Over the next few days, the gang returned. The attacks became bolder. They didn't just stop at paint or trash cans. One night, he came home to find that his car had been scratched, deep lines etched across the surface. Another time, someone left threatening notes on his doorstep, words meant to scare, to make him feel unwelcome. The neighborhood began to murmur, and he heard gossip spreading. People saying things like maybe he should just leave, or why doesn't he fight back? He ignored them all. Fighting back, at least in the way people expected, was not his style. He had ways of handling trouble that most could never imagine, but revealing them now would only draw attention, and attention was dangerous. He spent his evenings inspecting the property, reinforcing locks, checking windows, and making sure every corner of the house was secure. He did not panic. Panic had never helped anyone survive. Yet there was a part of him that could not hide the tension. Memories came back in flashes. The long, grueling days of training, the missions that had required complete focus, the knowledge that every movement, every action, mattered. He remembered being taught to anticipate threats before they arrived, to stay calm under pressure, and to act decisively when needed. Those memories gave him strength, but also reminded him of what he was capable of. something the gang could never imagine. One afternoon, while mowing the lawn, he saw them again. The gang lingered near the street corner, laughing and shouting at each other, glancing occasionally toward his house. They did not know he was watching. From a distance, he observed their behavior carefully, noting who seemed in charge, who followed, and who was reckless. He took mental notes as if planning a map of their patterns. It was instinct. He could not help it. Despite his military past, he lived a quiet life now. He did not want violence. He had seen enough, but he also knew that when people underestimated him, they made mistakes. The gang thought they had found an easy target, someone quiet, alone, and unaware. They were wrong. Then came the night that would change everything. It was late and the street was unusually quiet. He had finished dinner and was sitting on the couch reading a book. The sound of shattering glass broke the calm. He sprang to his feet, heart steady but senses sharp. From the window he saw them. The gang was in his yard, smashing the mailbox, overturning chairs, and breaking the small fountain in the garden. Their voices were loud, mocking, full of hate. He did not panic. He watched, calm and composed, letting them make their mistakes. In his mind, he was already planning how to respond, how to ensure that this would not happen again. He did not need to confront them physically just yet. Observation was key. Knowing their weaknesses, their carelessness, their arrogance, these would be his advantage. The gang laughed and jeered, thinking they were in control. They did not notice the quiet strength in the house, the sharp eyes watching them from the shadows. They were loud, reckless, and dangerous, but so were they to themselves, because they had no idea who lived behind those walls. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, the gang left satisfied with the damage they had done. The house was wrecked, the garden ruined, and the feeling of violation hung in the air. He waited until the street was empty, then stepped outside. He moved carefully, inspecting the destruction. There was anger, yes, but also a calm determination. He would fix what had been broken, but more importantly, he would make sure this never happened again. That night he went to bed as usual, but sleep did not come easily. His mind raced, planning, anticipating, preparing. He knew the gang would return. They always did when they thought they had the upper hand. And when they did, they would find out, in a way they could never imagine, that the man they thought was ordinary was far from it. He drifted into a light sleep, but his muscles remained tense, trained for readiness. For years he had lived with discipline, and that discipline never left him. The quiet man the neighbors thought they knew had a past that demanded respect, a past that would soon become very clear, though he hoped it would not come to bloodshed. He had patience, strategy, and the skills to protect himself and his home. The calm, orderly life he valued had been shattered, but not his spirit. The anger simmered quietly, but it was controlled. He knew that in the coming days the neighborhood would see a man they never expected, and the gang, full of hate and ignorance, would learn a lesson they would never forget. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight he simply waited, watched, and planned, confident in the knowledge that he was ready for whatever came next. The days after the first attack were tense. He spent more time watching the neighborhood from his windows, noting every movement, every shadow, every sound. Even a distant footstep or a car slowing down unnaturally caught his attention. The gang had struck first, and now they were testing the waters, seeing how far they could push him. He knew it was only a matter of time before they tried again. He continued his routine as usual, walking to the small store nearby, watering his garden, and keeping the house spotless. To any outsider, it looked like nothing had changed. But inside he was preparing, not with weapons or overt displays of force, but with observation, patience, and calculation. He knew that showing fear or anger would only feed the gang's confidence. Calmness was a weapon in itself. One morning he stepped outside to retrieve the mail and noticed something odd. A bicycle was lying on the sidewalk, its wheel bent as if it had been used roughly. He looked around but saw no one. The neighborhood seemed quiet, almost too quiet. That silence made him uneasy. He bent down to examine the bicycle and found a note tucked under the seat. He unfolded it carefully. The words were crude, hateful, and threatening. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he pocketed the note and went inside. He poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the wall for a few moments. His mind was racing. The gang was escalating, sending a clear message that they were not afraid of consequences. Most people would have panicked, called the police repeatedly, or even considered leaving. He did none of that. He had a different way of thinking, a way that came from years of experience and discipline. That evening, as the sun was setting, he saw movement outside again. The gang was gathering near the edge of his property, their laughter sharp and cruel. They were showing off, trying to intimidate anyone who might be watching. He stayed inside, pretending not to notice them, all the while carefully watching through the blinds. He noted who spoke the loudest, who looked around nervously, and who seemed to follow orders without thinking. Every detail mattered. Every small clue could give him an advantage later. Over the next few days, the attacks became more serious. One night, someone threw a brick through his window, shattering the glass and leaving shards across the living room floor. Another time, the front door was scratched and dented, a clear attempt to frighten him. Despite the damage, he remained calm. He cleaned up quietly, repaired what he could, and strengthened the weak points in his home. He was methodical, precise, and patient. He also began noticing subtle changes in the gang's behavior. They were getting bolder, but they were also sloppy. They left fingerprints, trampled his garden carelessly, and sometimes lingered too long, giving him enough time to observe them. He realized they underestimated him completely. They had no idea who lived behind that modest, calm exterior. That ignorance would be their mistake. One evening, he walked through his garden, inspecting the flowers and shrubs he had carefully planted. His hands were steady, but his mind was active. He thought about what the next step should be. He didn't want unnecessary violence. That had never been his way, but he did want them to understand that he was not someone to be trifled with. He thought of ways to protect himself, to anticipate their moves, and to make them hesitate. Strategy was key. Neighbors began noticing the tension around his house. Some whispered to each other about what was happening, wondering why the gang focused on him. Others shrugged, saying it was not their problem. A few brave neighbors offered to help or asked if he was okay. He smiled politely, thanked them, and returned to his routine. He did not want anyone to see more than what was necessary. This was his fight, and he would handle it in his own way. One afternoon, he noticed the gang leaving a strange object near his driveway. It was a small, crude device, something meant to scare or provoke. He examined it carefully from a safe distance. Using gloves and a small mirror he kept in his garage, he realized it was harmless if handled carefully, but the message was clear. They wanted to intimidate him, to make him react. He did not. He simply removed it, studied it, and stored it for reference. Knowledge was power, and he was gathering it meticulously. The gang's attacks continued, each one slightly bolder than the last. One night, someone slashed the tires of his car. Another time, they left broken bottles across the driveway. Each act was designed to make him feel vulnerable, to show that they had control. Yet he remained calm, collected, and strategic. He knew that losing control, showing anger, or acting recklessly would only give them an advantage. He had learned long ago that patience and observation were more powerful than brute force. During the day, he walked through his neighborhood as if nothing had happened. He watered his garden, spoke politely to neighbors, and even smiled at children passing by. No one suspected the depth of his skills or the discipline behind his calm exterior. To them, he was just a quiet man enduring trouble. But he was far from ordinary. Every movement, every glance, every decision was calculated, even in mundane tasks. One evening, as he prepared dinner, he noticed shadows moving outside. The gang had returned, creeping along the edges of his property. He did not panic. He continued chopping vegetables, listening to the faint sounds of their laughter and whispers. He had already studied their patterns, knew their timing, and understood their weaknesses. All he needed was patience. He knew the longer they lingered, the more mistakes they would make, and the more advantage he would have. Later that night, he reviewed everything that had happened in the past days. Each attack, each insult, each act of vandalism was a piece of a larger puzzle. He thought about how the gang believed they were in control, how they assumed he was just a quiet, ordinary man. He smiled slightly to himself, knowing they had no idea what he was capable of. That smile was brief but filled with quiet determination. He also thought about the neighbors, those who had offered support and those who had stayed indifferent. He appreciated the kindness, even if he could not rely on it completely. He knew he had to protect himself first, and that meant relying on his own skills, his own judgment, and his own discipline. No one else could do it for him. The tension in the neighborhood was growing. Rumors spread about the gang's actions and the quiet man who had endured them. People wondered why he did not fight back, why he did not move, why he did not call for more help. They did not understand that he was planning, observing, and preparing. His restraint was not weakness, it was strategy. Then came a night when the gang crossed a line. They did not just damage property. They threw heavy objects at his windows, smashing glass and leaving sharp fragments across the floor. It was meant to provoke fear, to show that they were unafraid. He remained calm, however. He moved through the house quietly, checking every window, every door, every corner. He made mental notes, marking the points where the gang was most reckless and most visible. He began thinking about how to respond, not with blind anger, but with precision. He planned quietly, ensuring that every move would be effective, safe, and calculated. He thought about timing, positioning, and the importance of remaining unseen until the right moment. The gang had underestimated him, and that would be their downfall. Over the next days, he continued to observe. He noticed their patterns, how they gathered at certain times, how they laughed and joked carelessly, how they assumed he was powerless. Each observation gave him more information, more advantage. He knew that the next encounter would be critical and he would be ready. Despite the growing tension, he did not live in fear. Fear was something he had learned to control long ago. Instead, he lived with awareness, focus, and patience. Every morning he walked through the garden, checked the house, and reviewed the patterns of those who sought to harm him. He moved quietly, efficiently, and deliberately. The gang, unaware of the quiet strength behind the house, continued their attacks. They did not see the calm man observing them, noting every misstep, every loud laugh, every careless action. They did not see the discipline, the skill, and the quiet power that had been honed over years of rigorous training. By the end of the week, he had a clear understanding of their methods. He knew when they would appear, how they would act, and what weaknesses they had. He had anticipated their every move, and he had a plan. The quiet man, the one who appeared ordinary, was far from helpless, and soon the gang would learn that appearances could be deceiving. As he sat in his living room one night, looking at the dim lights of the street outside, he felt a sense of calm resolve. The attacks would not stop, but he was ready. He would endure, observe, and wait for the moment when patience and strategy would give him the advantage. The gang believed they were in control, but in reality, they had already stepped into the trap of their own arrogance. He went to bed that night with a clear mind. He knew the next attack was coming, and he was ready to face it. Not with fear, not with panic, but with calm, focused preparation. The quiet man in the neighborhood was no longer just a neighbor. He was a force waiting, unseen, and prepared to defend what was his. The tension in the neighborhood was growing day by day. People whispered to each other about the gang and the quiet man whose house had been attacked so many times. Some admired his calmness, while others wondered why he had not responded. But he did not care about what others thought. He had his own way of handling things, a way that required patience, observation, and careful planning. Every morning, he woke up before sunrise as usual. The air was cool and still, and the streets were quiet. He brewed his coffee, poured it into a simple cup, and stepped onto his porch. He watched the street carefully, taking in the smallest details. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, but he knew better. The gang could strike at any time, and he had to be ready. During the day, he went about his routine as if nothing had changed. He watered the garden, tidied the house, and even chatted politely with neighbors who passed by. Most had no idea what he was thinking, what he was planning, or what he was capable of. To them, he was just an ordinary man enduring some unfortunate events. But behind his calm exterior, his mind was sharp, always calculating, always preparing. The gang had made a mistake in assuming he was weak or ordinary. They did not know that he had been trained to handle far more dangerous situations. They thought intimidation would be enough. They thought vandalism, shouting, and threats could break him. They were wrong. He observed them quietly, noting how they moved, how they interacted, and where they were careless. Every detail mattered. One afternoon, while he was checking the locks on his doors, he noticed a group of the gang loitering down the street. They laughed loudly, their voices cutting through the otherwise calm neighborhood. He did not react. Instead, he watched them carefully. They were sloppy, reckless, and too confident. Every movement they made revealed weaknesses, and he remembered everyone. He made mental notes, memorizing their patterns, anticipating their next moves. He also began using small measures to protect his home without revealing his abilities. Cameras were installed in discreet places, some motion sensors here and there. He checked doors, windows, and even the fence surrounding the property. Nothing was left to chance. Every night he walked around the house making sure everything was secure. Each time the gang came near, he learned something new, gaining an advantage they did not know he had. The gang continued to escalate their attacks. One evening, they threw stones at his windows, breaking small panes of glass. Another time, they overturned trash cans in the driveway. One member left graffiti on the fence, hateful words written carelessly in bright colors. Each act was meant to provoke him to show dominance, but he did not give them the reaction they wanted. Calmness was his strength. Despite the repeated attacks, he did not let fear take hold. Fear was a tool the gang unknowingly handed him every time they acted recklessly. He knew that keeping calm allowed him to think clearly and stay ahead. While others might panic or act impulsively, he planned, observed, and prepared. Every attack by the gang became an opportunity to learn and strategize. Neighbors began talking about him quietly. Some admired his strength of mind, his composure under pressure. Others were confused, wondering why he didn't fight back. Some even suggested calling the police more often, but he knew that outside help could not solve the problem completely. He needed to rely on his own skills and judgment. That had always been true in his life, and it was true now. One night, the gang's leader decided to make a bold move. They sneaked into the yard, hoping to catch him off guard. They knocked over a small tree in his garden and left footprints all over the freshly raked soil, but he was already watching them through the blinds. Every move they made, every careless laugh, every glance over their shoulders was noted. He was calm, patient, and invisible to them. He did not rush into confrontation. That was not his style. Instead, he observed, taking mental notes of who was leading, who was following, and who was reckless. He knew that each mistake they made would give him an advantage later. The gang's arrogance blinded them, and he would use it against them without putting himself at unnecessary risk. Over the next few days, he began making subtle changes around the house. Windows were reinforced quietly, doors were checked again and again, and small alarms were installed that could alert him to any movement. He also rearranged the garden, creating hidden pathways and areas where he could watch without being seen. These preparations were not obvious, and anyone looking from the outside would see nothing unusual. But they gave him control. He also spent time observing the gang from a distance. He noticed how they moved in groups, how they planned their attacks, and where they were careless. He could see that some members were easily distracted, while others were reckless in their confidence. Each observation gave him more information, a clearer understanding of how to anticipate and counter their moves. During the day, he continued his routines as if nothing had changed. He greeted neighbors politely, watered the garden, and maintained his house. No one suspected the depth of his planning, the precision of his observation, or the skill he had developed over years. He remained outwardly calm, almost ordinary, but his mind was always alert, always calculating. The gang's attacks grew bolder, but they also became more predictable. He noticed patterns in their behavior, the times they preferred to strike, the areas they targeted, and the way they overestimated their own safety. Each attack became an opportunity to gather more information, to study their mistakes, and to prepare for the right moment. One night, they returned with loud laughter and threats. They damaged the mailbox again, scattered trash across the driveway, and left graffiti on the fence. He watched them silently, noting every detail. They believed they were in control, but they had already made mistakes. Their arrogance and carelessness were giving him the advantage he needed. He also thought about the neighbors. Some were kind, offering concern and help. Others were indifferent or critical. He understood that he could not rely on anyone else to protect him. This was his responsibility. He had to be ready, aware, and capable. Every step he took was deliberate, ensuring that he would remain safe while gathering more information on the gang. Despite the constant tension, he did not live in fear. He had learned long ago that fear only clouded judgment and slowed reaction. Instead, he lived with awareness, patience, and focus. Every day, he strengthened his home, observed the gang, and refined his strategy. Every attack became a lesson, every threat a clue. By now, he understood the gang better than they understood themselves. He knew their strengths, weaknesses, and tendencies. He knew that they underestimated him completely, assuming that he was just an ordinary man who would respond with fear or anger. That was their mistake. Their arrogance blinded them to the reality that he had skills they could never imagine. One evening, he walked quietly around the yard, checking every corner. The garden, the fences, the small paths, everything was secure. He observed the street beyond, watching for any movement. He could see shadows in the distance, hear faint voices, but he did not react. Calmness was his ally. Patience was his strength. Knowledge was his weapon. Over the next few nights, the gang continued their small acts of intimidation. Broken bottles, slashed tires, and graffiti became routine. But he did not respond impulsively. He observed, he noted patterns, and he strengthened his defenses. Every attack only gave him more information and more control. He also reflected on his past, the skills he had learned, and the discipline he had developed. Those experiences were not for show. They were preparation for situations like this. The calm man in the neighborhood, the quiet neighbor enduring attacks, was far more capable than anyone could imagine. By the end of Part 3, he had turned every act of aggression into an opportunity. The gang's arrogance and recklessness were their downfall. He remained patient, calm, and ready. The quiet, ordinary man everyone saw was only a mask. Behind it was a mind that observed, planned, and prepared for the moment when their mistakes would cost them. The gang had no idea what awaited them. Their attacks had only strengthened his resolve, sharpened his awareness, and reinforced his strategy. Soon they would realize that they had underestimated a man who was anything but ordinary, and when that moment came, there would be no warning, only the result of years of training, discipline, and careful preparation. The quiet man had spent weeks observing, preparing, and waiting. Every attack from the gang had given him more insight, more understanding, and more confidence. He knew their patterns, their weaknesses, and their arrogance. He understood that every loud laugh, careless step, and reckless action revealed them more than they realized. Now the time had come to turn the tables. Not recklessly, not violently, but strategically, with precision and patience. He began subtly making changes around the house to increase his advantage. Some doors were reinforced with hidden locks. Windows were checked for weak points, and pathways were rearranged so that he could move unseen. Motion sensors and discrete cameras, which had already been installed, were now fully integrated into his plan. He knew every angle, every shadow, and every blind spot. To anyone else, it would look like ordinary home maintenance, but to him it was preparation for control. The gang continued their usual antics, unaware that their every move was being recorded and analyzed. They slashed tires in the driveway, left trash scattered across the lawn, and spray-painted graffiti on the fence. Each act, intended to provoke fear, instead sharpened his strategy. He observed quietly, noting who led, who followed, who was careless, and who showed signs of hesitation. Every detail mattered. Every mistake counted. One evening, the gang gathered near his property, their voices loud and crude, filled with the arrogance of youth and ignorance. They were unaware that they were walking into a situation far beyond their understanding. He watched through the blinds, remaining calm and silent. His heart rate was steady, his mind alert. He analyzed their positions, their movements, and the potential paths they might take. The confidence they displayed was their weakness. He started using small, indirect methods to unsettle them without revealing his presence. A few carefully placed objects made noises when moved, startling them slightly. Shadows in the garden were shifted to give the impression that someone was watching closely. These subtle measures caused hesitation among the gang members, breaking their rhythm and making them overthink their actions. The first cracks in their arrogance had begun to appear. Meanwhile, he observed the neighbors from a distance. Some of them were curious, wondering what was happening behind his calm exterior. A few offered sympathy or tried to suggest solutions, but he paid little attention. He had learned that relying on others could be unpredictable. The gang's actions had to be handled with precision, and he alone had the skill and patience to do it properly. Over the next few days, he expanded his observations. He noted the gang's habits, when they gathered, how they communicated, and the mistakes they often repeated. He even discovered small conflicts within the group, rivalries and egos that caused tension. He stored all this information mentally, preparing for the day when he could turn their own flaws against them. Patience was his greatest weapon. One night, as the gang approached his driveway again, he quietly positioned himself to observe them. They were loud, arrogant, and careless, just as he had expected. One of them stumbled over a misplaced object he had subtly left the night before. A small spark of fear ran through the group, though they quickly tried to mask it. He noted it carefully. Their overconfidence made them predictable, and predictability was the key to gaining control. He also began using indirect strategies to make the gang question themselves. A misplaced shadow here, a quiet noise there, the sound of movement that wasn't really happening. These small actions caused confusion and hesitation. Members of the gang started looking over their shoulders, questioning each other and making minor mistakes. Without directly confronting them, he was already beginning to assert control. At the same time, he reinforced his home's defenses. Windows were checked again, doors secured with additional hidden locks and small alarms integrated into objects around the property. Everything was subtle, everything discreet. Nothing would reveal his full capabilities yet, but everything would ensure his safety and give him an edge. He was preparing for the eventual confrontation without rushing into it. The gang, frustrated by what they thought was resistance or misfortune, began making riskier moves. They stayed longer on his property, speaking more aggressively, trying to intimidate him and each other. But their arrogance only worked to his advantage. He had already anticipated their impatience and had planned for the disruptions they created. Each misstep gave him more confidence and a clearer sense of timing for his actions. He also considered the psychological aspect of his plan. Confidence and control were as important as physical readiness. The gang had underestimated him for weeks, thinking that silence and calm meant weakness. Now their fear of the unknown, their doubts about each other, and the tension he had created would weaken them further. He had studied human behavior extensively and knew how to manipulate situations subtly, without ever resorting to unnecessary aggression. Then came a night that would begin to shift the balance more clearly. The gang approached with the same arrogance, laughing loudly, slashing tires and overturning trash cans. This time, however, small traps he had set quietly moved or made noises as they stepped near them. One of the members stumbled over a garden stone he had subtly shifted, catching the attention of the others. Panic began to bubble and tension grew in the group. They were no longer confident, no longer completely in control. He observed their mistakes silently, noting the leader's frustration and the subtle signs of fear among the group. Every movement they made now revealed their lack of preparation and understanding. The quiet man they had underestimated was no longer invisible. Through patience, strategy, and subtle manipulation, he had begun to break their rhythm without ever appearing aggressive. In the following days, the gang's confidence continued to waver. They argued among themselves about strategy, placement, and timing. They questioned their own abilities and the safety of their actions. Each internal conflict, each hesitation was exactly what he had anticipated. By remaining calm, by using indirect control and observation, he had begun turning their arrogance against them. Meanwhile, he continued his daily routines to maintain the appearance of normalcy. He waved to neighbors, maintained his garden, and carried out ordinary tasks. No one suspected the depth of his planning or the control he had begun to exert. To them, he was still the quiet, ordinary man who endured harassment without complaint. But beneath the surface, he had orchestrated a precise strategy, weakening the gang psychologically and preparing for the moment when he would need to act decisively. Small victories encouraged him further. He noted the gang members' nervous glances, the hesitation before they took risks, and the subtle mistakes they made. Each act of recklessness now had consequences they could not predict, and he had placed himself in the perfect position to capitalize on them when the time came. Confidence, arrogance, and carelessness had become their greatest weaknesses. He spent his nights planning carefully, considering every angle and scenario. He knew that he could control the outcome without unnecessary violence if he maintained patience, observation, and precision. The gang's lack of awareness, combined with their overconfidence, gave him all the leverage he needed. He was preparing for the moment when the balance of power would shift completely in his favor. The neighborhood, unaware of the quiet battle taking place, continued its routine. People commented on the vandalism, whispered about the quiet man, and speculated about what he would do next. None suspected that the ordinary-looking neighbor had already gained control of the situation in subtle, invisible ways. He was the calm, strategic force they could not see, the silent observer who would ultimately decide the outcome. By the end of Part 4, He had turned the situation entirely to his advantage. The gang had begun to doubt themselves, to question each other, and to hesitate in ways they never had before. He had not needed to confront them directly yet. His strategy, patience, and careful manipulation were already weakening their control. The quiet man was no longer just enduring harassment. He was orchestrating the outcome, setting the stage for the moment when he would finally reveal the depth of his skills and take back control completely. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. The neighborhood had settled into its usual routine, with only the faint hum of distant cars and the occasional dog barking breaking the silence. But inside the quiet man's house there was no rest. He had spent weeks observing, preparing, and planning, and now the moment had come. The gang, who had underestimated him from the start, were about to discover that the ordinary man they had harassed was far from ordinary. He moved through his home with careful precision, checking every window, every door, and every corner. His movements were calm, deliberate, and silent. Each step was calculated, each breath measured. He had set small, subtle traps, reinforced his defenses, and studied the gang's habits so thoroughly that he could anticipate their every move. Patience and observation had brought him to this point, and he knew exactly what to do. Outside, the gang began their usual antics. They crept onto his property, laughing loudly, breaking small objects and shouting insults at the house. They were confident, reckless, and careless. They had no idea that every movement they made was being watched and analyzed. Their arrogance blinded them to the danger they were walking into. The quiet man did not move immediately. He remained hidden, letting them make mistakes, exposing their weaknesses without revealing his presence. One of them stumbled over a small object he had placed earlier, a subtle distraction that caused confusion. Another shouted at a fellow member for not watching carefully, creating tension among them. Their overconfidence was dissolving, replaced by hesitation and fear, though they did not yet understand why. He took a deep breath and moved quietly to a position where he could observe them fully. Every step they took was predictable, thanks to the careful observation and planning he had done over the past weeks. He had memorized their habits, their weaknesses, and their tendencies. He knew who was impulsive, who was cautious, and who was easily distracted. Each member was a puzzle piece, and he already knew how to manipulate them without raising suspicion. The gang's laughter grew louder as they attempted to intimidate him. They smashed a trash can, slashed part of the fence, and threw small stones at the windows. They believed they were in control, that they had the upper hand. But their mistakes were stacking up, giving him the perfect opportunity. He remained calm, observing, letting the tension build until it reached a point where they were no longer confident, no longer coordinated, no longer dominant. He then began to act. Slowly, deliberately, he triggered the small alarms and subtle traps he had prepared. Motion sensors caused lights to flicker. Small objects made noise when moved, and shadows shifted in ways that confused the gang. They looked around nervously, questioning what they were seeing. The tension grew among them, and their coordination started to break down. The arrogance that had guided their attacks was replaced by fear and doubt. He did not confront them directly yet. He allowed them to feel the consequences of their own recklessness. One of the gang members stepped on a loose board he had positioned carefully, causing a loud noise that startled the others. They began arguing,